Yeah, so thanks everyone for showing up today and coming out for this topic. Um, I hope it's helpful and informative. For people who don't know me super well, my name is Katie Turner, and I'm a psychologist in Calgary. So I work with clients all over Alberta, is where I'm registered, as well as New Brunswick, because New Brunswick allows kind of anybody registered to work with people there remotely. So some of my areas of specialty, we're covering a lot of them in this presentation. I've had my own journey. I discovered that I was a highly sensitive person after I was already in psychology and was already in the registration process and working in the field for a few years. I also kind of stumbled into my own intuitive awakening between finishing grad school and then going more further in the field. So it changed a lot of my kind of belief systems and experiences and really called into question a lot of just the conscious mind approaches alone. So I also do a lot of work with like spirituality, intuitive awakenings. The majority of my clients are highly sensitive people and also empaths. I am both as well, and I'll talk about the differences there. Um, Burnout is another area of specialty for me as well. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why highly sensitive people and empaths can be kind of a double-edged sword of the gifts of those traits, but why we can be more burnout and overwhelm can be one of the things we might be prone to, and that can be a problem. And I'll also talk about high functioning, high achieving, and being how to be a highly sensitive person who has goals, who wants to achieve things in the world but caring for our nervous system and doing that in a sustainable way. So, a bit about what we're going to cover today is, yeah, I've touched on this, the highly sensitive, like what is a highly sensitive person? What does it mean to be an empath? Some of the signs and symptoms of burnout and what we want to watch out for. Burnout rates, I'll talk about kind of where that is right now and historically, because they are on the rise. More, I've seen it in my practice and in preparing for this presentation. I updated more of a research search and I wasn't sure if it was just something I was seeing, but it seems to be across the board. People are kind of more burnt out than ever, and there's multiple reasons for that. So I'll talk about some of the causes and contributors. It won't be in depth because it's a multi-layered. There's many possible pathways, but just to give people an idea of things to kind of think about in their own life and these different levels of individual workplace system stressors that can kind of lead to burnout. And I'll talk a bit about prevention and recovery and how the role of boundaries and self-care strategies, our own personal work can help protect us and help us recover. So just before I get into it, for my liability and purposes and insurance purposes, I have to kind of let everyone know that this workshop is really more psychoeducational format. So I hope it can give helpful information, but if anything stands out for you, like please do take that, use your own best judgment, take it to your own healthcare provider for your own screening. It's so great how there's so much more awareness about different mental health and conversations, but it can actually be pretty complicated on an individual level. So there's a lot of symptoms that can overlap with things, or there can be other things going on too. So just please seek your own personalized support for your own treatment needs. It's not me diagnosing anyone here. And a bit about the term highly sensitive person. So not sure kind of where everybody's at in terms of like what they've known about highly sensitive or not. It really is a term it's come out of extensive research of decades of research by Dr. Elaine Aron. So it seems to be an innate trait that's found in about 10 to 15% of the population. And it's found across cultures. It's found in different species. It seems to be more an evolutionary strategy of hanging back, waiting, getting more information before jumping right in. So they see it in like about 85, 80% of fish will go right in for the food, and about that 15 to 20% will wait back and see if anything happens to those other fish first before they come in. Um, so it's not a diagnosis. It's not good or bad. There's just differences with it. I'll often compare it to different plants. Like you can have a spider plant or an orchid, and they have different like the spider plant's a lot hardier. The orchid's super beautiful and has other really positive traits, but it can need different care conditions. So it's almost thinking of like it's a way our nervous system is wired that has some benefits, but it can also have some downsides as well. Um, I will share, there's links, and I'll send out kind of the links for the self-tests to everybody's email if they're okay receiving that. If you haven't taken the self-test already, it is on Dr. Elaine Aron's website. It was recently updated in the last year, so she's done more research. So if you haven't done it in the last year, it could be worth going back and checking in again. She has different dimensions. She has some more research around it. So it's been evolving in the definition, but she's done a lot of studies around it. So equal numbers of men and women tend to be highly sensitive, but because our culture can often discourage sensitivity in men, men may not often as identify it with it as much. And so the scoring is a little bit different as well. Um, Studies have found that highly sensitive people can be more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, or mental health concerns if they have a difficult childhood or past trauma. But with a good enough childhood, it's no more likely than anyone else to have any negative impact. And they may even be more well adjusted. It's not super clear on that. So again, it's not a diagnosis, it's not a disorder, it's more of an underlying temperament. Um, it's not the same thing as being introverted or extroverted, but more highly sensitive people do identify as introverted. About the research shows about 70%, and about 30% are more extroverted, highly sensitive people. It's estimated, older studies estimated that about 50% of people seeking therapy were highly sensitive people. This may have changed, I am not sure, because I think as mental health has been more normalized and people realize like you don't actually doesn't mean you have a problem. Many people can go to therapy just for self-care, being aware of their own patterns, wanting to do like to thrive even more or noticing where they're blocking themselves. Oh, but highly sensitive people do tend to get a lot out of therapy. And I'll talk about kind of why that is. Part of it is that depth of processing and knowing themselves very well. So I think that double-edged sword side of sometimes having our nervous system be more sensitive, there can be downsides with that. But when we have the right tools, those can be really positive because there can be the tendency to be more self-aware. And when you have things that actually work for you, more likely to use them and actually enjoy doing that and understanding yourself. So some of the important points from Dr. Aaron's work is that highly sensitive people, like for anyone, whether they're highly sensitive or not, we all have kind of an optimal level of arousal. It's like that peak performance curve. We want a certain level of like stress or anxiety that motivates us to like prepare for the work presentation, to study for an important test. But if we get too um, if we're too stressed out, then that performance drops. So, because if we start getting into fight, flight, freeze, it's like usually there's actually a drop in performance. So nobody does well whether they're when they're in that out of that optimal window. Um, the kind of downside for that for highly sensitive people is because our brains process sensory information a lot more deeply, we are more prone to get into that fight, flight, freeze or have experiences of being like that over arousal window. So it can feel like blowing it when you knew not performing as well as you thought you would. Um, the other kind of downside is that sensitivity isn't really our culture's ideal. I think that is shifting in many areas, but on a whole, it's not quite there yet. So there's often this like toughen up, power through it. And people can kind of override their sensitivity to the point where they're going into that fight, flight, freeze, or even like burning their system out. And that other piece around highly sensitive people can may be more affected than others by being raised in more traumatic home environments. But without a troubled past, they're no more psychologically distressed than anyone else. And some studies have shown that that might be even less than the general population. Some of the common traits of highly sensitive people is it's experiencing the same emotions that the rest of the population experiences, but we tend to experience like higher highs and lower lows. So it's a bit of a stronger emotional affect, and that has positives as well as negatives because it can be very moved by something very beautiful, very connected, like powerful feelings of love, gratitude, but it's also when things are tough, like we're going to feel that on a deeper level as well. Highly sensitive people often prefer to be on the sidelines of a situation for a while before entering. So we often want to give ourselves time to prepare. If we can even map out or drive to a new destination when we have something high stress, like we can bring some of that arousal down. We tend to be very aware of subtleties or small changes. We often process very deeply, so we may want to consider every detail or possible outcome before acting, and this can serve us well, but we can also be prone to like an analysis paralysis and overthinking and getting stuck in that. We tend to be a lot more aware of the thoughts and emotions of others, and again, this is helpful, but there's a double-edged side to it too. Of sometimes when we're more aware, we may be more prone to really empathize or take on the pain of others. It can lead to kind of boundary struggles. It can also, highly sensitive people can tend to have a bit more of an indirect communication style because we do pick up a lot on subtleties from others. If they're hinting towards something, we can kind of jump in with like, oh, I think I know what you're asking, or I think I know what would help. And we can do that we might think we're communicating what we need, but it may actually be very indirect. And with those statistics, it's about 80 to 85% of the population is not highly sensitive. One of the mismatches there can be sometimes we're hinting at something and we think we've been pretty clear, but it might have gone right like over under someone's radar, and they may not have realized we were like actually asking for support or trying to say no indirectly. So sometimes we need to work on how do we be kind but more clear as well. So again, there's that piece around we might be more impacted by negative environments, but I also find that really self-aware, highly sensitive people tend to be very attuned to their internal environment. So we can be more attuned to notice, like, oh, this is actually impacting me, or my energy's off, or I'm having this feeling and it's not how I want to feel. So if we can use that to be motivated to say, what do I need to do about this? Do I need extra support? Like, how can I move through this? Then if we have the tools to kind of move through things, like this doesn't have to mean that we're stuck in these negative environments. I won't get into it in this, it's beyond the scope of this presentation, but for all people, our brain and our nervous system holds negative emotional experience different than positive emotional experience. So that can be that like big T trauma or even smaller things that we may not realize. There may be a certain like boss or coworker's personality that just really like sets you off, or you spiral and you ruminate. And maybe they're similar to like a really harsh parent or someone. There are tools that when we have the right tools to kind of process that through our nervous system, it doesn't have to be a life sentence. It's like we can work with that emotional memory to decrease the intensity of it so it's not as intense in the present. But in order to do that, we need to be aware that that's even happening. So that sensitivity can help us pick up on when our stuff is coming up and be more internally aware. So I think that's a positive, but it can be a mixed blessing for anyone who's like done a lot of their work around people who don't do their work, like it can feel mixed. Highly sensitive people often are heavily attuned to kind of like cause and consequences. So it can lead to acting more conscientiously, like being more aware of our impact on others. And I think we need more of that in the world, especially recently. Other common traits of highly sensitive people is often having an unusual concern, unusual on a social level. Like I think it's fair to have a concern about social justice in the environment, expressing a higher degree of compassion than maybe the general population. And this is often like you can see this in childhood as well. Elaine Aron also has a self-test for high sensitivity in children. So it can be interesting to look at that for your own childhood or any children you know or have. Easily overstimulated. So again, sometimes it's not like an anxiety thing or you're like a self-sabotage thing. Sometimes it's just more of like there's too much sensory stimulation and someone's tipped over into fight, flight, freeze and has those experiences of blowing it. Highly sensitive people are often gifted, artistic, or passionate about the arts, um, may have a strong interest in spirituality and often involved in specific practices. It's interesting because in some of Elaine Aron's earlier work in highly sensitivity, there's a couple places where she talks about highly sensitive people have more experience, like psychic experiences or spiritual or intuitive experiences, but she kind of just mentions it and leaves it. I have found, like, through my own journey, I found that highly sensitive people actually seem to have at least the ones I work with, seem to have a pretty strong, like, intuitive connection too. And I'll get more into that when we go into the empath part. They may or not be aware of it. Like, I was not even aware of mine initially until I started to be more conscious of it. And then I could see where that empathic ability, like, had always been there. But she is actually coming out with a new book about highly sensitive people and spirituality relatively soon. I think it's launching in the next couple months. So she's got stuff about that on her website. Highly sensitive people also report a greater emotional reaction to events. Again, it's within the normal range of the emotions you'd expect. They're just a little bit higher ups and higher downs. We may notice unusual, like we might have a harder time processing change or be more distressed by change, having more vivid dreams. And really, because this is a nervous system wiring and way of the brain's way of processing information, these characteristics really first show up in childhood. So they've kind of always been with us. Highly sensitive people can complain about overstimulating or like not pleasant environments. I know for myself, when I worked in community mental health, I'd like pack my own lamps downtown and then shut off all the fluorescents because I just like could not handle working under those all day. So we usually kind of might know like what needs to happen in a space for it to feel a bit better. We might be more impacted by the energy of spaces. And that's even more so if you're empathic. We can also have more physical sensitivity. So it might be a greater sensitive to pain, to stimulate, like being more affected by caffeine, and most medications and substances. There is some research, it's on Dr. Lane Aron's website and some others around whether it's like alcohol, drugs, or prescription medication. Highly sensitive people can often have benefit from even like the below the regular therapeutic dose of medication. So if you're ever looking at medication for yourself and you are highly sensitive, it can be worth like pulling that up to also bring up to your provider to say, like, would it make sense to kind of start at an even lower dose and build up from there? Um, I talked about that, like speaking in a considerate but often indirect way. And again, it can be helpful, but it can be a problem for us since we're not the dominant majority. And sometimes we need to learn to be kind and considerate and respectful, but like a lot more direct in what we're actually saying. And that can be a process. Highly sensitive people often find nature to be healing, calming, being moved by its beauty, having benefits from spending time in nature as well. And so a bit about the senses and how we receive intuitive information. So this is kind of before we move into the empathic ability. I just want to frame like what that is. And being empathic is not the same as having empathy. Empathy is really the practice of communication and sharing, like imagining putting yourself in someone's shoes. It's kind of holding safe emotional space for someone to share that it's like, oh, it makes sense you feel that way, or it sounds like you're feeling sad or frustrated. Like that's empathy in action. Empathic ability is really more, the way I frame it is more, it's like it's an intuitive ability. And this is an important distinction for a few reasons. But basically, before I dive into the empathic ability, we all have the ability to connect with some level of intuitive information. Intuitive ability is really it's not woo or like only for people who are born psychic or like seeing angels or ghosts from a young age. It's more this sense of like how we know without necessarily rationally knowing. And it's an ability that we all have some level of it, almost like any other ability, like reading, athletic ability, music. Some kids are just really good at something, and others it takes a lot of work and you're never going to be that great at it, but you can get better. So it's similar to that. Um, Basically, intuitive information comes through the gateway of our five senses. So clairvoyance can be this kind of seeing. It might be in the mind's eye, like imagination. It's very rare that it shows up for people like it is in the movies of like, I see dead people. It's usually not that scary. It's usually not that extreme. Some people might see like auras or colors, but sometimes it could just be like a symbol, like maybe it's a feather or coins that you keep seeing everywhere or repeating numbers. Or you're struggling with a question and you drive by a billboard and it just like jumps out at you. So it's really this like getting this communication through the visual sense. Clairaudience is more about hearing. So again, it might be self-talk that just has a different quality. It's very rarely like hearing voices. Um, and also being clear, like intuitive ability doesn't mean mental health break, although there can be overlap. I don't support opening up intuitive ability if there's any concern about like psychosis or not functioning in this level of reality. That is not my specialty, but I do have some resources kind of through my newsletter and other piece around like distinguishing those. But so when we're talking about kind of hearing things, it's really more about things like that might pop out at us. It could be overhearing a part of a conversation, like something that speaks to what something we might be struggling with or has meaning. A clairsentience is really like a clear feeling. So it can be feeling the emotions or physical sensations of others. It may also be a gut feeling or physical response, like getting chills. And this type of intuitive ability is often referred to as empathic here. There's also smelling or tasting. These tend to be a lot more rare, but they can happen. Claircognizance is just a clear knowing. It's kind of just suddenly knowing something. It pops in our mind. We can't really explain it. It doesn't really make a logical sense. But it might be just like, I really don't trust that person. I don't like them. I don't know why. They haven't done anything. And then later you're like, oh yeah, now I know they did all these shady things. But there wasn't enough like logical information to know that ahead of time. So if people are curious about knowing kind of their intuitive ability, I do have a quiz on my website. It's not diagnostic. Again, it's just for fun. Because when you know what your dominant sense is, the more you keep working with that sense, the rest of them will start opening up over time. But it is a process. It takes time, and it's something we can develop, but it takes that time and practice. So basically, the piece about being an empath is there is debate. The psychological field and medical field really doesn't believe that empathic ability is like real. Most places would brush that off. Personally, because I have had my own experience with it, I work with empathic clients. Like I really do believe it is a real ability. The problem with when you search it online is it has not been extensively like researched and studied in the way that highly sensitive person trait has been studied. So take what you see with a grain of salt, and it will likely change and evolve over time. There is also a ton of misinformation about empaths out there. So, I mean, there's some wild stuff out there that I wouldn't promote or or say that that's necessarily true. So, like, I believe it's real, but we would never, just because we might pick up on the emotions of people and feel it in our own body like it's ours, it doesn't make us an expert on their story. Like we have to be clear of like what's ours, what's not ours. That is a practice. Judith Orloff is a psychiatrist in the US, so she's one of the people I'd often refer people to her site and her books to find like more credible information about it. I have a link to her self-test, but this is kind of it here as well. There is a lot of overlap with the highly sensitive again, but so like for me the main kind of difference between the two is like you can be one or the other or both, but in general, like not everyone who's highly sensitive is also going to be empathic or an empath, and not all empaths identify as being highly sensitive, but there seems to be more overlap with empaths also being highly sensitive as well. Yeah. And so like I won't get into depth around this part, but like there are some things around just some of the things I see kind of floating around social media around like empathic ability. Again, I just want to come back to that multi-pathway model of like there's lots of stuff out there in social media that can be really helpful about mental health, but it's also short snippets of things that it's really tough to actually get a full complete picture just on that. So I've seen things floating around of like, well, it's not actually empathic ability, like you're maybe not diagnosed as autistic, and it's like that might actually be something to screen for because especially women with autism can be missed. It's getting, there's a lot more awareness in the field of like that the actual research for men does not apply in the same way as it does for women. And there can be high empathic ability can be part of that, but you can also be empathic without like, there isn't the research around this, but in my clinical experience and practice, people can be empathic and not autistic. Um, I've seen things around statements like, oh, you're only empathic because it's a trauma survival response, where it's like that may amplify it for some people. That may be one pathway. There isn't enough research that I know of to say what the percentage of that would be or not, but it's not the only pathway. Like some people are just empathic without an extensive trauma history, childhood history. So just take things with a grain of salt, especially anything around like empaths and narcissists. There's a lot of actually like wrong information and false information because I've done more specialized training in survivors of pathological love relationships or narcissistic relationships as well too. That was showing up in my practice a lot at one point, and it's not that simple, and a lot of what's out there is actually just straight up wrong. So I won't get into that today, but just putting it out there. So, some of the common presenting concerns for highly sensitive people and empaths can be things around boundaries because we are so sensitive, we're so tuned in, we're so aware of right or wrong, and we generally have like big feelings, big hearts, like want to help, want to give. With the empathic ability, especially, we can take on other people's energy, and we may have codependent patterns where it's not traditional codependency because we actually are feeling someone else's distress so highly and not realizing and not knowing how to separate that we might be more invested in them changing or trying to change, heal, or fix other people or the world so that we can feel okay. Kind of managing those intuitive sensitivities and again, just like burning out in a culture that's not designed for highly sensitive people and a culture that's quite frankly burning out a scary amount of the population before and in recent years, even more so. So, for today, we're really going to focus more on the burnout component. Um, and again, it's not there's lots of gifts with high sensitivity and empathic ability, but there with anything there can be that risk factor and that double-edged sword too. So burnout is really a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion. And the thing that's important to know about burnout is that it is really more a buildup of like too much stress over a long period of time that then starts to result in these predictable symptoms. Um, it was first recognized in research in about the mid 70s with healthcare professionals, but since then we know a lot more about burnout and that these symptoms are not limited only to healthcare professionals. So it can happen in any area. Like work is the one that's focused on a lot, but any source of chronic stress can cause burnout. So it could be parenting, it could be like conflictual relationships and the stress of that ongoing. If we're in a caregiver position, like those can all cause burnout as well. So I'll focus more on burnout in general, but things that are important to note about burnout is that it's not actually a mental health diagnosis at this time. So when we look for doctors or therapists who are not as experienced with burnout, it is not in the DSM-5. So one of the important things about knowing about burnout is that it is often missed for people. Burnout is an area I specialize in, but a lot of the time when people are coming in to seek support, they don't realize that they're burnt out. And I think this is due to a few things. There's a lot of research. There's a lot more awareness and public conversation around depression symptoms, anxiety, um, being a high functioning person or high achieving or even perfectionistic. It like we usually want to just be like, give me the tools so I can like just keep doing all the things and be more productive. And this can really make us at risk of burnout too when it's not sustainable long term. And in terms of that long-term stress, it's for some people, like sometimes we might go months, sometimes it might be years, and sometimes it could be decades where we can override our body or our brain. But eventually, if we're always in this depletion state and always overriding, at some point something's going to have to give. So that's kind of different for everybody, but that can result in like physical or mental health challenges. And burnout typically proceeds in about three phases. So there's physical and emotional exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. So, one of the dangers with burnout is as we go through these symptoms, you're probably going to notice if you have any awareness of depression or anxiety, but depression in particular, it's with depression treatment, oftentimes we lose the ability to want to do things we used to enjoy. And part of like that treatment or recovery is like just kind of making yourself do things in small ways anyway. The important piece of distinguishing because burnout can turn into depression and it can end up as a diagnosis of depression. When I work with like short-term or long-term work leave, it is usually the most common diagnosis that's going to happen is usually depression at that point. But burnout, because the depression didn't come out of nowhere, it came out of an ongoing long period of stress over time. We do not want to just push through to recovery because that can actually make burnout and all the symptoms worse. Like we need to build in recovery and letting those neurological circuits recover and our system recover. So with all of these phases, the emotional exhaustion, cynicism, detachment, these all progress. Like they may start more mild and then start getting more moderate to more severe. So sometimes I'll encourage people if it resonates for them to make almost like a little cartoon like a gauge of green, like a half circle where it's like green is good, everything's humming along nicely. Most of us don't live in green all the time if we have some level of stress or responsibility. Then there's kind of yellow where it's like, yeah, there's some things that aren't great, but I'm doing okay. And then orange is like, this is getting into concern. And then red zone is like this is going to be crisis soon. So we can think of it on this like spectrum here. And burnout can be such a slippery slope that once we're in it, we often don't see it. We don't realize how bad it is, especially if we're really high achieving or over functioning. And I'll get into that later. But it's important to kind of recognize like what are some of those signs or symptoms so that if we find ourselves there, we're more likely to actually recognize what's happening and not just keep pushing through it. So some signs of that physical and emotional exhaustion can be things like chronic fatigue. So early on, it might be like a lack of energy or feeling tired more days than normal. And at later stages, we can just be so physically and emotionally exhausted, drained, or depleted that it's hard to do anything. In for sleep problems, like in early stages, it might be having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Maybe it's a couple times a week. But as it progresses, it's usually that insomnia gets worse and we're getting into persistent, like every night, feeling super exhausted, but just can't sleep, can't stay asleep, get a good quality of sleep, maybe waking up in the middle of the night and having just feeling super stressed out, not being able to relax again. So again, it progresses on that continuum of severity. I also with the self tests, I have the highly sensitive self test empath, and there's some burnout self tests at the end, and I'll send those out after. Forgetfulness and impaired concentration. So sometimes it's like maybe a little bit harder focusing, a little bit of forgetfulness in early stages, but it can get to the point where we like really can't get work done. Things are piling up. We're getting more and more behind. Um, Physical symptoms can come up and like somatic symptoms. So that's in the body. It's like chest pain, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, stomach issues, headaches. Like make sure to medically assess everything. But sometimes that's just our body showing us the signal of like the severity of the stress we've been under for how long. As our body gets more depleted, our immune system also gets weaker. So we get more vulnerable to catching things, having them last longer, like cold, flus. We might have other immune medical problems or even develop more like serious health concerns when it's been going on for a long time. So it's like burnout can sound like, oh, you're just burnt out. It's not a big deal, but it actually can have very serious complicating factors in terms of our physical and our mental health longer term as well. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody, but it's just important to take it seriously. We also have like overlap with depression symptoms as well, such as changes in appetite. Like, and this is kind of different person by person. Like some people, when they're stressed, like don't feel hungry, they're not eating enough, they're losing weight, like they're not getting enough nourishment. Their digestion is kind of shutting down. Other people are more like emotional eating, where we're feeling stressed, so we're turning to food, snacks, eating for emotional reasons, and gaining weight. Anxiety, we can have mild symptoms in the beginning, but it gets more serious that it can start interfering with our ability to work productively. It might cause problems in our personal life. And again, depression, this is the one I see like the most common is kind of you might feel mildly sad or occasionally hopeless, but as it gets worse, it can often kick into a diagnosis of actual like depression, um, or major depressive disorder. So it can get to the point, it can get really bad to the point where people are like where it can be actually dangerous. Where for caregiver burnout, someone might actually like encourage someone to like end their life because they just can't do it anymore when that is not ever what they'd want to do when they're well, or people can get hopeless, even like suicidal when it's really at that severe like red zone area. So it is important of like when something is unsustainable, we do want to be able to zoom out and say like, okay, with everything on my plate, like how long can I keep this up? And like when are signs that this is starting to break and I need to look at the overall the amount that's on my plate. Like, is there a different way? Is there any other resources here? And I'll get more into that as well. So with that cynicism and detachment, like again, it can mirror a lot of depression symptoms as well, and it can even lead to depression. So you can be burnt out and then depressed. Is like loss of enjoyment. It can seem mild, like not wanting to go to work, being eager to leave, but then it can start extending out to all areas of our life. So at first, if it's work-related burnout, we can withdraw from colleagues, maybe not want to chat, not want to go for lunch, not want to do anything social. But then that can start to spider out in other areas where we're not interacting with our partner or family, like not seeing friends, just kind of disconnecting all in general. And this is one of those ones where many people will be like, oh, like this is a warning sign, like I better force myself to like get out and do more. And that can be part of a recovery plan, but if we're also not looking at like actually the long-term stress here is not sustainable, it's like forcing yourself when you're exhausted without also making space for the rest and recovery can make things worse in the long run. So again, we can start isolating ourselves more and more. It's often just like a feeling of detachment and emotional numbing where we just feel like we're going through the motions and kind of floating above our body, like not really engaged, feeling like, what's the point? Um, just feeling almost like robotic can be a common symptom as well. And the hard part with burnout too is like it becomes such a vicious cycle when we start to get into the moderate or more severe presentations of burnout because the more it goes on and the more intense these symptoms become, we actually start losing cognitive capacity and ability. And it's not permanent, but it's like temporary and we need that rest or recovery and like neurological circuit recovery to regain cognitive functioning. So if we're working all these crazy hours, like never stopping, not enjoying anything, the hard part is like we start to make more smaller mistakes. It takes us longer. It's harder to be productive. We have more brain fog, more memory problems, more problems with concentration and focus. So it's like it takes more energy to even do things, and having to redo things. I mean, it can get so bad. I've seen multiple cases where it can get so bad that we can lose like the ability to recall basic words like pen or like water bottle. Like it can be concerning where people may get screened. Like it's if you have that, I mean, screen with your doctor for any memory concerns, but it's also like burnout at severe burnout can actually have that impact. And like the good news is it is not long term, but that is a concerning flag there too, because at that point, like finding ways to get that rest and recovery is going to be the most productive thing you can do rather than actually pushing through. Because I mean, I've people can get like lost on routes that they've taken for 10 years before because they just like their brain capacity isn't there anymore. And that is really concerning when it gets to that point. But it's not permanent. If people have like work protected benefits, if you have the ability to take a leave, like if it's getting to that severe point, usually at that point, if that's available to you, that would be one of the best things to do because if you can take about 4 to 6 weeks
Sounds
of
good,
like
buddy.
full off recovery time, um, then it really you'll recover quicker. Not, I fully get as an entrepreneur, not everyone has that ability. Also, as a parent, like sometimes you're looking at, okay, how do I slowly like climb up this slope again? Where it's going to have to be prioritizing rest and recovery over a much longer period and likely longer period than we want to start recovering. So there's more than one pathway, but just being aware of that slippery slope. Yeah. And so I mean, I've always seen higher burnout rates kind of for highly sensitive people, especially for high achievers and people who tend to overfunction in times of stress. And I'll talk a bit about those traits and how we know if we have them and ways to work with them when I get into some of the contributors for burnout here. But I do think it's important to put this into the current kind of context that's happening kind of in North American countries right now too. Is that prior to the pandemic, about half of workers reliably reported that they experienced burnout at some point in their lives. So this is like at some point in their working career, about half. The concerning thing with like the pandemic and post-pandemic is because there was so many stressors through the pandemic and so much change and uncertainty. There's like loss of childcare. There's figuring out working from home, like kids are out of school. For many people, it was like such a stressful time for so long that took a toll on like overall resiliency, nervous system capacity. It the second wave for the pandemic for any natural disaster recovery and the psychology of disaster recovery is research has kind of consistently shown that in fire, floods, like major natural disasters, you have a kind of second wave of mental health about a year to 3 years following a natural disaster. So it was really predicted that about prior to the pandemic, about 3 out of 10 people would meet criteria for some kind of like diagnostic mental health issue. Whereas following the pandemic, it was expected that that would hit about 5 out of 10. Um, and also what I saw a lot kind of in my practice, and I'm not an expert in organizational psychology or like the psychology of change, but I was pretty like it's pretty discouraging to see off so many companies, and I think it was more the norm of once restrictions were lifted, it's like, okay, like back to work. Like now let's just go really hard and like really push these things. But it was really out of touch with like where people's nervous systems were actually at. Like some people might have had a break and really enjoyed the isolation time, but like that was not the case for everyone. And a lot of people were just like frazzled and fried already coming back. And then I think most of our systems really did not account for that and just pushed people even harder. So, and there's multiple factors. Like the pandemic's one piece, but there can be other reasons that add to this as well. So for in 2020 a 2023 Canadian survey found that like actually at the time of the survey 42% of Canadian workers reported feeling burnt out. So that's almost like the same level as at some point in your life to just like we are burnt out right now. There was difference around age groups too. So as you can see, like millennials, those who are 27 to 42, and Gen X, like 43 to 58, reported the highest level of burnout rate. So that was 55% and 51%. There's likely multiple factors for that. Some can be like trying to be in school and working and surviving. Um, there can be like social media burnout, just rising costs of living. There can also be that sandwich generation. For many people, you might be actually like parenting and working. You might even have aging parents and like sandwich generation pressures as well. But most people, the number one reported contributor to that was heavy workloads for understaffed teams, lack of communication and managerial support, or like missing tools or resources to perform at work. And so Statistics Canada has seen that as well too, that like workers have been reporting very high levels of workplace stress, about 21.2%. Some industries are higher than others, but I have found just with individual work with people around these issues and I've done my own burnout work as well because I'll go into the personality factors. Like I actually have most of these and I've had to learn how to manage them better in my life, because I have gone through my own cycles of burnout as well. But it's more and more rare that people have like jobs or school or like stressors where it's like I go in, this is my time to work on it, and I leave and it's left at work. Smartphones, email, like we are so connected that it makes it really hard. And some workplace cultures, it's actually like it's hard to actually set those boundaries so that we can have that off time. So I find more and more people almost need to be safely and assessing kind of in their situation to say, like, where can we actually kind of control more of the flow? Because I've seen in many industries that the kind of the reward for like a good job of doing work can often just be more work, and there's always more work than there are the resources to actually keep up with the work. So I think it that's where the rise of this like term of like quiet quitting, which I don't think really should be called quiet quitting. I think it's more of like this is actually your contract, this is what you're paid to do, and these are your hours you're paid to work. So like how can we do our best to kind of work within those hours, but not be doing all this overtime or after hour stuff, not be available outside of that when that's not our scope, or advocating for those breaks or sustainability. Yeah, and so I'll get into some of the personal contributors here too. So when I talk about causes of burnout, again, there's multiple pathways, and I'm not going to get into the details of each of these because it's thinking of it as like almost like nesting doll systems. We have our own self and our own personality, the way we operate, and we can have traits that can make us more likely to burn out than people without these traits. But then there's also the system factors. There's workplace situations where it's like traits or not, these workplaces are burning out a lot of people overall. And these societal, like larger systemic issues. So it's beyond the scope today to get into the nitty-gritty of each of these, but in terms of the high functioning and over functioning, those are important ones to know about. And when we are aware of all of the levels, we can kind of get a sense of what are we dealing with at different phases in our own life, and where do we have some control, or what might be helpful for us in terms of options of where we can focus our energy to make things better. And the good news, bad news with those personal contributors is like that is work we can personally do, whatever system we're in, to potentially improve things. So um, over functioning is really, yeah, I'll get more into the over functioning and kind of the perfectionism, high achieving part of this. And it's just kind of knowing that for some people, we have high expectations for ourselves. We function really well under stress. We can go into when things are stressful, we can kind of get horse blinders on and just go into, okay, how do I like work my way out of this? And that can make us prone to not taking a higher level perspective of like zooming out and seeing the larger picture to say, like, is this actually sustainable? Is this realistic to keep doing this? Do I need to actually have some more direct conversations that may be difficult or challenging for me, but that do hold different boundaries. So I'm not just like getting all this work dumped on me and burning myself out in the process. We can sensitive people too, and people with a lot of these personality traits, it's like one of the risks is that if we're not performing up to the level we feel we should be, of like, I'm not keeping up with, like, I'm behind on work, I haven't met this deliverable, there's a danger of us really internalizing that and thinking we're falling short or failing, where it's like the system and the workload might be failing us, not the other way around. And so there is work we can do to learn to better separate that and not feel so guilty or take it on as much. Because we're often good at seeing it for other people of like, oh, like that's not sustainable or that's not fair for your boss to expect you to do four different roles. Of course, no one's going to do well at that. Um, but we can have blind spots when it comes to ourselves. So, and I say this with like no judgment. I tick off most of these. I have had before I understood burnout, I had cycled through it a couple of times. And then I went overseas to volunteer and relax and recover from burnout. And I burned out in my volunteer position. So then I was like, oh, I, yeah, I guess this is a me problem, not just the environment. And so I just share that because it's like there is hope, even if the environment's tough. It can be a longer road. That's different for everybody. But yeah, and so one one trait that can be important to understand about ourselves is over and under functioning. So some of this Brene Brown talks about, Dr. Harriet Lerner talks about as well, where people tend to go into a default, almost nervous system pattern in times of stress where we either overfunction or we underfunction. It is not something we choose and sit there and decide what we're going to do. It's kind of our knee-jerk reaction, and we don't even often realize we're doing it. So overfunctioning is kind of in times of stress. These are the people who take on a lot of responsibility. It's like we're great in a crisis. It's like we're going to take control. We're going to make a list of tasks. We might delegate that or give some to others, but we'll often take a lot of those back because like we're going to do it better. I say that lightly, but the downside of this, it is our culture values this more, and it can be helpful for being productive. But the shadow side of it is that it often is a way that we avoid feeling our own feelings, having more space for anxiety, uncertainty, like processing difficult emotions. And it can show up like being really highly competent and in control, but it does increase our risk of burning out because it's like we can just jam our schedule so full of responsibilities that we don't have a chance to slow down. And people don't necessarily realize like this isn't, you might like, oh, look, they're doing great. Look how productive they are. But it's like there is a rebound effect to that later, and it can come at our expense later. The other danger of overfunctioning is like overfunctioning nervous systems. We, I will use the metaphor of like our kind of like a car has a gas gauge and a gas light that will come on to tell you like this tank's getting low, you better fill up on gas soon. But it tries to give you enough time that you have a reasonable amount of time to like get gas. If you don't get it right away, you can get it later. Overfunctioners, we don't, I say we because I also like I tend towards this a lot. But we won't realize we need a break until we like needed a break weeks or months ago. So we can easily push through and not feel it until burnout is now getting more moderate or severe. So with that gas gauge analogy, it'd be like if your car told you you need to get gas and you have maybe like 10 minutes to get it, or it's already starting to like sputter. Like it would be a very useless and frustrating warning system. So with overfunctioning, it can be helpful to find out more about that if that's kind of resonating for you. And there are ways we can work with that system to be aware of it and to put kind of structures and goals in place to rein ourselves in a little bit. Like overfunctioners can be a bit like the workhorse and not the donkey. Whereas like when the donkey's tired, it's just gonna stop. Like that farmer could be beating on it, pushing it, and it's gonna lay down and it's not gonna do it anymore. Whereas like a workhorse will keep going and it'll work itself to death. And over functioners, it's like we are prone to that. So sometimes we need to be also be the responsible farmer who is setting in breaks, who's like, oh, okay, yeah, you want to work on this instead of actually doing your self-care, but I'm going to force you. We have our minimum self-care that we have to keep doing even when it's stressful. So those are some of the ways we can work with it, but even understanding it is a really helpful first step. Um, on the flip side, underfunctioning is more the opposite stress response. So it's often like freezing, pulling back, avoiding, kind of it resembles like a freeze or flight reaction. So that stress feels overwhelming and just kind of shutting down. So it's not about shutting down, but it's about being like, okay, how can we do what we can control and leave a bit of space too, so that we're okay. For high achieving and perfectionism, really, a high achiever is someone who constantly is setting and pursuing challenges, like challenging goals, working hard to accomplish things, and often attaining success through effort, discipline, perseverance, and grit. Um, with the overachieving and overfunctioning and the high achieving, perfectionism can be another common risk. So perfectionism is really unrealistically high standards. So it often comes with overly self-critical evaluations, fear of failure. Like we might spend an hour on an email that should have taken 5 minutes and isn't a big deal. So it can lead us to put in all this extra effort and energy into things that it does not require it for like practical real world results. So this can be very exhausting and can also make us a lot more prone to burnout as well. And the main takeaway here is we can be highly sensitive and have a more highly sensitive nervous system and still be a high achiever, but we want to work on the perfectionism aspect, and we want to work within really thinking of like marathon, not sprint energy. Like if we have way too many things on the go and we're trying to like excel in many areas at once that all require a lot of energy, it's like that is going to come at a really high personal cost, or it may not be achievable. Like sometimes we need to put limits and focus on this is my priority right now, and this might be another good opportunity, or it could be a good potential, but it will just tip me over into not this, it won't be sustainable. And sometimes some of the good things that can come out of coming out of a burnout cycle is like we can learn to recognize that earlier, and it can give us a feedback loop of like it is not worth going into that. So I need to put some kind of guardrails in place for myself to not get there again, or not have it get that bad. Like even if it's hard to say no, even if it's like there's fear of missing out or it's a possible good opportunity, we have to be more aware of our energy and kind of rationing that to the best of our ability. Um, So some of the workplace contributors, so again, it's not just personality factors, but often if you get personality factors plus workplace contributors plus systemic issues, you're getting higher and higher risk. It's like this, the cards get stacked against you. Um, Having enough time to finish your work in a day, people who do not have enough time are about 70% less likely, or people who have enough time are 70% less likely to experience high burnout. And again, I find that's getting almost more and more rare in many industries. Um, so when workload is constantly feeling unmanageable and you're never able to kind of meet expectations, like that wears on people. They can feel hopeless and lead to burnout over time. Again, sometimes we don't need the workplace conditions to change. If it's like actually safe for us to set limits and we're not going to get fired, like we'll still feel secure there. Sometimes working on our own guilt or our own perfectionistic expectations and ability to communicate, like sometimes we can have more sustainable experiences even in the same job or workplace culture because we're just not taking on as much anymore and we're not feeling as bad about it. Because usually those are much higher level decisions of like who's cutting people for record CEO profits and not having a like enough of a workforce there to do all the work they're wanting to take on. It's like, yeah, that's not an individual worker job to fix it. And so things like having control and autonomy where that makes sense, not being micromanaged, having clear expectations and communication and like clarity on what your role actually is. Feeling supported is another big one. Like employees who feel supported by their manager are again about 70% less likely to experience burnout on a regular basis. And when there's really unfair, like toxic dynamics at work, that is a very high risk factor for burnout. There's some studies that show like really toxic managers and bosses, like there's a high level of depression, anxiety, or even like suicidality for employees who are working with someone just extremely toxic. So again, it's just to say sometimes it's not about us personally. It's like if the environment is very toxic, we may need to see what we can do to work within it, see what other options there are. Um, Potentially even see like when is it time to leave or make a change. Because yeah, in an ideal world, it's everybody would be able to take leave. Companies would deal with like toxic or abusive bosses, but in the real world, that doesn't always happen. So sometimes we need to tread carefully, kind of see like just see like have other people taken leave successfully? Were they discriminated against later? Do I need to even consult with like a workplace lawyer or anything, or make a change? And so mainly too, like the other piece that's kind of important to note too is like that work-life balance. And a lot of these sound really negative, but an interesting piece of research as well too is that people who identify like their work as their calling and they really love it, it feels like their purpose, are also more at risk of burning out. Because if we love it, if we enjoy doing it, we can spend so much time and so much energy. It can just take over so much of our life without realizing it that we're, again, working these like neurological circuits over and over and over again. It's almost like overheating a phone or a computer where it shuts down. So even if we love it, there can still be a risk of burnout there because it's more about like a holistic and working different parts of the brain too and having breaks. Yeah, and I also just want to touch on of like the societal contributors too. So it's like we do live in a culture that still has a legacy. We have this capitalistic like this legacy of colonization and white supremacy culture. So it's like there are real systemic issues that can make people more at risk of burnout than others. So things like women tend to be more at risk of burnout. And again, it's case by case basis. It doesn't say this is the case in every family or for every woman, but statistically, women are often carrying more of the childcare responsibilities, household labor, even working same hours. Um, Race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, just like feeling safe in the world and how much energy that takes, worry about discrimination or people like unfair treatment, things like body size, disability, neurodiversity. So it's just to say that it's easy to be overwhelmed with all of this, but it is something that's important to acknowledge of like we're not all starting in the same place. Um, and it's not a problem that's going to be solved in one generation, but it's not an excuse to like not do the work or not look at some of these levels and like what privilege we might hold, where might we use that to help empower other people, um, where might we use our voice if we hold a little more privilege to help be part of policy change that can support everyone. Yeah, and sometimes it might be a thing too of like if the workplace is really discriminatory, not open to policies or accommodations that people may actually just really need to do their best and not suffer mental health consequences, and they can still perform the role. It can be worth looking at like, is there a better fit somewhere else as well? So a bit on kind of the burnout prevention and recovery, again, where we can to try to have work-life balance for what we can control. With burnout too, part of there's a good book called it's either The Key or The Secret of Unlocking the Burnout Cycle. But part of burnout too is that we are processing stress through our body, and we still have this evolutionary system in our body where if we see like a deer or a cat suddenly go into a freeze state because they hear us like a snapping twig and they don't know if it's a predator, they will freeze, immobilize, and then when the threat has passed, they kind of dramatically shake that out, and then they go back to like full relaxation. When we think about kind of humans and our ongoing stress, we're often like in our brains being like, okay, gotta deal with that, gotta send that email, gotta do this thing. And we are not actually like processing that or digesting it in our body or nervous system. So there is the aspect of like what we can control and dealing with stressors, like solving problems, looking for options, doing what we can. But our body also needs to metabolize that and break it down, or those cortisol and adrenaline, like stress hormones, start building up more and more in our body as part of that burnout process as well. So the kind of general recommendation is if for like a regular workday of stress, we want about 20 to 30 minutes of movement to actually process that through our body and be like kind of resetting that stress response. So I mean, consult with your own like healthcare provider about what's safe for you or what exercise works for you, but it could be walking, it might be yoga, it might be shaking or dancing, like really just being able to move that through you can be part of that burnout prevention and recovery. Early in recovery, it's usually not like intense training. For highly sensitive people, it is not anything that's like a competition does not count as that recovery workout anymore. That is now like another source of stress. And in later stage of burnouts, it may be just like gentle movement, gentle stretching, like a quiet walk in nature and kind of building up as your capacity gets higher. The research is kind of mixed around what type of exercise is best for different people. So that can be something we need to experiment with and find for ourselves. Um, Trying to connect with a sense of meaning or purpose can really help us as well too. So that can often counteract some of the negative stress aspects. So it might be saying like, if our job isn't toxic, like what could we do to be engaged? How do we want to show up? Like, what can we control? Um, and it might just be like, I want to have a positive interaction or like make someone's day a little bit better. Um, it might be I'm showing up here to be there for my family, like keep a roof on their head, provide food for them, and that can help. Sometimes with many types of work, like school projects, certain professional work, it can be this ongoing workload that is there's no clear like, hey, we finished this, success, yay, like now the next thing. So we often don't get that kind of feedback loop and dopamine loop of like, you did this, it is accomplished, you feel good about it, now we move on to the next thing. So if there's ways to kind of break those things down, like for students, it might be saying like, hey, I did this one assignment, I'm this far in, I'm gonna like celebrate that. And for workplaces, it might be, can you make some of those for yourself? It can also be helpful to like add in tasks that are the term is like high task mastery in the burnout literature. And what that really just means is sometimes it can just be really satisfying to like clean the dishes or the kitchen counter. It's kind of something where you can take 10, 15 minutes, like you take a chunk of time and then you immediately see the results of the effort of those chunks of time. Because not having that feedback loop can just it feel like what's the point with all of this a lot of the time. Um, Things we can do for basic self-care, like eating well, sleeping, resting. Our brain often doesn't know the difference between this feels good in the moment but makes things worse long term versus this can take some time to start feeling better in the moment, but it's actually going to help me long term. So examples of that might be like just checking out in like retail therapy, but now we got more financial stress and bought things emotionally that we don't actually need. It could be like having a glass of wine every night or a couple glasses where it kind of turns that stress response off because it is a depressant, but it's also a depressant. So it like makes our mood worse longer term, interrupts quality of sleep. So just looking at sometimes it doesn't feel as good right in the moment, but it can be building new habits to say like, can I go take a walk? Can I call a friend? Like maybe I meditate or journal, um, practice gratitude to do something that's going to actually help feel better in the long run. Things like cultivating resiliency can really help too. So it can be looking at like what steps can I take right now to bring us closer to the future we want to be. Sometimes even just working with our mindset, like if we're in a bad work situation, maybe it's not time, maybe it's not the right time to leave or just quit because we have financial reasons to be there. We're getting work experience that's important for the future. So it can sometimes even shifting and just taking that power back to be like, I could quit, but I'm staying for these reasons for me. And how do I keep it within this boundary of, and like start working towards like the future I want to build. Um, and sometimes it's just, it can get into almost more like existential meaning and purpose too. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about his experience surviving the concentration camps. And one of his quotes out of that book is that one of the last of his man's freedoms or like human freedoms is the ability to resist our environmental influence. Like we may not be able, we can choose our attitude in any set of circumstances, and like we still have the freedom to choose how we react or respond. So it's not about bypassing or like toxic positivity to be like, oh, everything's fine when there's some real injustice or things that are not fine going on, but it may be focusing on like, well, who do I want to be in this and can I keep showing up the way I want to show up? Social connection and positive support is also really helpful, and also knowing when to seek support. So it might be seeing, okay, when might therapy be helpful? Is there other like group programs or resources that I may need to dive deeper into? Do I need to speak to my family doctor or find someone for help with this, potentially take a leave, look at a change here? Um, and boundaries and assertive communication can be another part of that too, because oftentimes like we can't really rely on other people to only ask us like within our capacity. That is often a skill set we need to develop and get more comfortable with and like feel the guilt, feel the discomfort, and get better at advocating for what we need anyway. Even if that's like, I'd really love to see a friend, but like I actually just need to crash this weekend because I'm so exhausted. It might be being able to go back to your supervisor and say, like, okay, you want deliverables on this, this, and this, but which one, with the time constraints here, which one's higher priority? Like, you make the call here, or I'm running it by you, but I'm also letting you know I'm not actually going to deliver on all of these in this time frame because it's not realistic. Um, and those are skills that can be improved with practice. So, um, yeah, and so I want to leave some time for questions too. So these are some of the self-report skills that could be helpful. Just the highly sensitive empath test. If you're curious about your dominant intuitive ability, as well as some burnout scales, and I will send those out if people would like them, so they have the direct link. If you have any questions or anything standing out for you, whether it's now or later, you're welcome to send me an email to connect kind of one-on-one. You can find out more about me here, and I'm also on social media as well. So I tend to share a lot of resources. I'd also be curious if anyone wants to send feedback. I may send out a survey, or you're welcome to email me as well, just because I'm kind of looking at run. I'd like to be able to run more of these community, like donation-based fundraising webinars, and I'd love to know what people would find valuable, what they'd like to hear more about. And I'm also exploring, I've ran groups on burnout for highly sensitive and empathic people as well, and I'm considering running another one. So if there's enough interest there, I'd look at doing that again. Um, Part of my own intuition and part of my own on that, like taking care of the burnout piece and the capacity piece is I am exploring more of like expanding into more like like free or lower cost resources too, but kind of beyond the one-on-one model. Because in therapy, like one-on-one, there's a limit to that before I start hitting my own burnout. Whereas I want to be able to reach more people in more sustainable ways where it's not the same. Because therapy is a higher cost or people need benefits for it. And I think there can be a lot of benefit in groups or other schedules as well. So yeah, I will turn off the recording here and pop back on.